Hello and welcome to the 100th video to be posted on this channel. So still slightly surprised we've got this far and got this far so soon, but today we'll answer one of the many questions that have been submitted in answer to the appeal I put out a while back for this very purpose. So hence the fireworks at the start, but we're celebrating now, and whereas originally I had thought I would answer a lot of questions and join them together into big chunky videos in the way that I've done in the past, what I think I'll actually try to start off with is we'll do at least a week where every day I'll post a video answering one question. So they'll be shorter than usual, but you'll get more of them. But I think that's probably easier for people to find the answers to the specific questions. Now, we've had almost 100 questions, so thank you very much for sending those in. Some of them are ones where I think it'll be better to do a longer video, and I'll try and get around to that. Some are ones where they're quite similar to other questions, so I've rolled them into one and we'll just talk about that theme. But I'll try and get around to as many of them, all of them if I can. If we're doing it one by one, that's obviously going to take a while. So we'll see how it goes, how my availability to film them lasts, of how many. I'll try and get a week's done first, but we might then go on to do another week of the same. Don't worry, I'll still be doing the long videos as usual in the course of October and beyond. We'll just give this a try and see what happens, and in some cases, if I can work out how to do it, I'll try and link the short answer to a longer video I've already done on a related topic, and in the future we can change that. If people want, I can paste them all together and make a compilation ones of answers, but as I say, I think that's probably makes it harder to find out the answers to particular topics, questions, that sort of thing. So let's just stick with one at a time, and we're going to start with a general one today, but a few more fireworks and then we'll come into that. Right. Thanks again for all the questions, and thanks for watching the channel. This question's really about how do you approach history? What's the best method? And it's what's the importance of understanding history in its own context without ideological distortion or deconstruction. And this is very much my personal view, but I wouldn't hold it unless I thought it was the right one. You must try as far as possible to approach the past on its own terms, to look at the evidence and then try to work out what the evidence is telling you, what picture that is suggesting of this world that's no longer here, that's gone, this society, these individuals, these human beings who lived their lives and did these things. If you come with prior assumptions and you go looking for something, whether it's on the basis of some theory of interpretation or your political, religious, philosophical beliefs, whatever it might be, then you will make the evidence, consciously or unconsciously, you will make it fit your own preconceptions. You will always find what you're looking for. It's very rare where someone goes and says, well, I was expecting this, and then actually, no, I've got to admit the evidence shows something completely different. Because human beings work that way. We tend to see what we want to see. We notice the things that jump out to us because they confirm what we're expecting to see. And this is, true of any situation in life. If you look at a situation and you're expecting something, that's what you'll tend to notice. And it's often interesting when you see eyewitness accounts of an event that different people will single out different things. It's even to basics, like if you've got a witness describing, it was a tall man or woman, a short man or woman that did something. They were thin, fat, whatever it might be. Compared to what? Everyone will start off with an assumption of what it means to be tall, what it means to be average height, that might be accurate, might be a true reflection of the statistics within that population, or might just reflect that somebody who's 6'3" is probably going to see most of the rest of us as pretty small. Somebody 5'1" might be the reverse. Everybody's tall to them. Or they might overcompensate, and they might simply notice other things. Reminds me of there's a Raymond Chandler short story, probably with Johnny Dalmas, one of those characters, before Marlowe comes along, where this man gets murdered, but he's come into a bar and he's asked, he's looking for a woman wearing a bolero jacket, and it's sort of singled out by the detective that, what man would know what this is? He must have been told you have to ask for someone in a, I think it's blue bolero jacket or something like that. And, a lot of detective stories will work on this basis that the witnesses tell them what the things that interest them, what they understand, what they don't understand, or something that jars because you wouldn't think someone would know that. So this is the great danger. So the one thing you must try to avoid as a historian is approaching the past with an agenda. And simply because you won't then do anything useful. You are just going to confirm and validate your own preconceptions as far as you're concerned. And that's fine for all the people who want to read it or hear it who have exactly the same preconceptions as you. But it doesn't really, you haven't learnt anything. You haven't tried to understand. It's also very important to not to judge the past, in a sense that, yes, it's significant to work out what's different from today, why this society has these different attitudes. So, it's quite hard for us to stand in the modern world that the Greeks, the Romans, pretty much every society in the ancient world could accept slavery as just a natural thing. Oh, that's fine. Yes, they're individually groups of slaves like Spartacus and his rebels rebel because they want to be free, but they're, Kirk Douglas notwithstanding, there's no real sense that they're actually sort of campaigning to try and abolish slavery. And, when the Roman Empire becomes Christian, they still accept slavery. And it's just this sense of, well, that's just how the world is. It might not be very nice and nobody wants to be a slave, but nevertheless, that's how it is. Now, that's odd to us, but there will be plenty of things about contemporary society that will seem distinctly odd to the generations to come. And things that we just accept as normal will no longer be considered not only normal, but perhaps even, palatable in any way. So again, judging the past is not what we're about, not what historians should be doing. And I can illustrate this with a story. I remember back when I was in the OTC, the Officer Training Corps at Oxford, and I was doing my doctorate. I think we were on MTQ2, one of those courses, and as part of it, I was with the artillery troop by then, everybody had to present a little talk about either a battle or a command or a leader from military history. And, a mixed unit, and one of the women cadets came up to me, and she was one of these very bright, very capable people. She's there at Oxford University, but studying geography, not a historian, completely different discipline, approach, and all this sort of thing. And she'd been allocated, which that was a bit rough, Boudica. So she came up to me and said, Adrian, can we have a chat about this, just because you can point me in the right direction of things I should look at, the sources, that sort of thing. That's fine, it's I was a graduate student at the time, and the thought of any graduate student, this great belief, because you're obsessed with this subject, is that this subject will somehow make you interesting to the wider world, and particularly the opposite sex. So, this is great. It's not at all. There's 40 of us or so in this room. This is not any romantic thing. And anyway, it's interesting. You have somebody from a different discipline who is clearly a well-read, but in a different framework to yourself, intelligent, analytical in their approach. But the question surprised me is that how she introduces it, well, you need to tell me a bit about Boudica, but from looking at it, she wasn't very nice, was she? And obviously, it's casual and chatting, but a historian, particularly someone studying at the time to be a professional historian, you'd never occur to you to think of historical figures as whether they're nice or not. It's just not. But I think you're trying to understand what they did, you're trying to work out what they were trying to do, how well it succeeded, their abilities, their weaknesses, their strength, the society in which they operated, the political system, military system in which they operated, all of these things. Basic niceness isn't something that concerns you. So it was jarring, because again, you're dealing with somebody, as I say, very, very bright. It's just they're not a historian. History hasn't been a big part of their academic upbringing up to this point. They've probably done a bit at school, but not beyond that. It didn't particularly resonate with them. And they're thinking in terms of goodies and baddies, in a sense. Now, obviously, it's just a chat, I know, but it always reminds me that you can't assume, particularly if you're doing the sort of thing I do when you're writing, hopefully for that general audience, for someone who isn't necessarily first and foremost a historian and obsessed with history, just thinks, oh, I'd like to know about that, this is interesting. That the assumptions they're bringing to how we should go about this may be very different to the approach that's familiar to someone like myself. And as far as I'm concerned, it isn't my job to tell people whether the Romans were nice or nasty. You shouldn't have to explain to the reader, if you're describing massacres, mass enslavement, atrocities, cities being burned down, razed to the ground, all this sort of thing, that these are terrible, bad things. This is not nice. This is not how you behave. None of the books are meant to be a recommendation to write, you've seen what Julius Caesar did to Gaul, now go off and do this in your career. You don't have to tell people that cruelty, that massacre, that murder is bad. You shouldn't have to. I mean, if they can't work that one out for themselves, then there's probably not a lot of hope for them in terms of being a moral member of society. So that's not the job of a historian. The historian is there to understand. So it isn't about whether Boudica was excessive in her, the rebellion she led, the massacres that occurred at Canulodunum, Londinium, Verulamium, the three main cities that were sacked, and the tortures and atrocities that are attributed to her followers. Because all of those things are clearly terrible, but also it's terrible that Boudica had been treated in the way that the Roman sources describe she'd been treated, that she'd been flogged, her daughters raped, generally abused, that the settlers in Canulodunum have been abusing the Trinobantes, and there's a reason why the Britons rebel, and there's more than little justice in their cause. But there again, it's not a question of going on and saying, well, how much justice do they have? Does that excuse the atrocities they commit? All of this sort of thing. Historians are not there to judge. They are there to explain what happened and to try and understand why it happened. What are the motivations of these people? That's what you need to do. As far as possible, you need to write and think about it as Tacitus, the historian, said, sine ira et studio, without anger, without prejudice. Now, you can make a very good case that Tacitus didn't succeed too well in doing that, because there's a lot of spleen and cynicism in his historical works, but he's probably, compared to other ancient historians, there's a lot of, if you've only got to read Cicero's speeches, to see the level of polemic that passed for normal in politics in the courts, and some historians are quite similar. So by comparison to others, this is not bad. Our aim is hopefully less biased than that. Now, obviously, it's impossible for you to remove all your preconceptions, all your assumptions about the world and people and how they behave. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. It's like saying with anything else, well, I'm not going to be, the greatest tennis player in the world, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't try and improve my game. You can get better. You can get better at what you do, even if you are not going to be the best person ever and you're not going to be perfect at it, because generally speaking, in any human pursuit, none of us are perfect. We get near it, perhaps, they're very able, but not most of us nowhere near it, but we improve upon ourselves. So the aim is this Tacitian ideal of without anger, without passion, and without prejudice. Now, some people like passion when they read history. They like somebody to get very excited and clearly to like or dislike the main players in the work they're writing. But again, it doesn't help. And there is a great danger, I've talked about this a lot of times in interviews, that you start to imagine the figures like Caesar or Cleopatra as you'd like them to be. You create a mental picture of them, and then when there are gaps in the sources, you assume how your idealized, your created Caesar would actually behave, and assume, well, that's what he must have done. And even some pretty sober and distinguished scholars have fallen into this trap. It's very easy to do. Now, it's fine to say this is what I think is most likely that he or she did, but it isn't fine to say this is definitely what they did. Now, again, some people dislike the uncertainty that I think is important when you're writing history, where you've just got to say, look, these are the sources, they only tell us so much, there's a lot they don't explain, and they don't really tell us the motivation of many of the main players, and they don't tell us precisely what happened in what order, but this is, as far as I can reconstruct it, as close as I can get. Some people want you to be far more positive. But that's false, because the sources simply don't allow you to do that, or at least it's very, very rare. So history needs to be understood. We need to look at the Romans and we need to understand how and why they did things. So obviously, and again, another example would be empires are terribly unfashionable these days, and any power that's seen as an imperialist or colonialist and all this sort of thing, these are terms of abuse in a way that they weren't necessarily in the 19th century, at least in many Western countries, particularly the countries that had empires. Often at least a sizable part of the population felt that these were good things and that they were benefiting the wider world apart from themselves, or that they were just natural because we're strong and therefore we deserve to dominate, which is a very old idea. It's back there in Homer. The sense that your worth plays out, and that's how you should be treated with respect. You should have the best of things because you are braver, wiser, more articulate, better looking than everybody else out there. But today we'd think of an empire automatically as a bad thing. And you do find there are books written where the Romans are the villains, they're the monsters that are going out just finding excuse after excuse to conquer their neighbours, massacre, exploit their neighbours, enslave their neighbours, all this sort of thing. And there is some truth in this. You've got to look at each individual case, and there are certainly examples of all of those things. And the Romans do conquer most of the known world, they do exploit it, they do benefit from it, or at least sections of Roman society and individuals do benefit from it in a big way. And they don't seem to have any concept that other peoples out there have any particular rights. It's we dominate because we can, because it's good for Rome, and it's to protect our status, our interests, as well as our territory. But that's what you've got to do. You've got to try and understand what they're doing. In the same way, you've got to understand the motives and the behaviour of those they're conquering. And this is a big theme of my book, Pax Romana. You've got to accept the fact that in many areas, lots of leaders and communities welcome the Romans and never ever fight them. Or some, like Boudica and her family, welcome them and then it turns sour and they change their mind, understandably enough, and rebel. But if you just have a simplistic idea of the Romans being baddies, then it often extends into turning everybody else out there into goodies. And suddenly they're just innocent victims of oppression. Again, I've talked about this in the Conquer the Proud series, where we've got a lecture on imperialism, so I might see about linking that to the end of that if I can work out how to do it, to the end of this video. So it doesn't help if you just go in and say, right, empires are bad, therefore we're just going to see how bad the Romans were and how cruel they were, and we'll just assume, we'll give the benefit of the doubt to everyone else. The Romans commit plenty of atrocities, they are often aggressive, they fight wars that are not really justified even by Roman standards. Other people do the same things as well, or similar. And it's not about deciding, well, morally, the Romans are worse than everyone else because they're bigger and stronger and should know better, or they're more civilized and should know better. There's this strange idea you'll get when people write about 19th, early 20th century empires that the European powers ought to behave better because, I don't know why. It's an odd assumption that they're not just human beings like everyone else, and they're as flawed as those they are conquering, exploiting. But again, people get very worked up. It's much harder to write about that era without getting involved in all sorts of angry debates, because many of these issues are still alive and they're part of the politics of the countries that were former imperial powers and the countries that were the colonized, the occupied, the parts of those empire. Whereas you don't get, letters to the newspapers written by a relative of Boudica complaining about what was going on. We can view these more dispassionately, and that's really how we should approach all history. We should try to understand first, because only through not judging, but trying to work out what happened, why, how these people behaved. Leave it up to your reader. Leave it up to those who are listening to judge for themselves. As I say, if somebody's not capable of realizing that massacre is a bad thing, then no matter how many times you slam it on the page of saying, and the cruel Romans did this and the cruel Romans did that, and this was horrible and this was atrocious, they're not going to, it's not going to register if you can't work that out for yourself. It's pretty obvious. There's also the element where I would say this is an extension of how I used to teach, and I think it's the best method. What I'm trying to do is present the evidence in as intelligible a way as possible and try to show readers how we understand history. But you leave the final stages to themselves. You credit them with the intelligence to take this on and then work out, okay, this is what I think about Caesar and what he did here. Or this is what I think about the Roman Empire and its methods of governing the provinces and this sort of thing. It's not about slamming my ideas down people's throats. It's about trying to understand. I'll suggest what I think, but beyond that, comes back again to understanding. The most important thing a historian can do is understand the past and help others to understand the past. It's not about judging. It's not about ranting and showing how wonderful I am by me criticizing or praising other people in the past. The Romans were human beings. So were the Gauls, so were the Syrians, the Sebastini, whoever, whichever group you look at. They are just humans like us. Different societies, different attitudes, different assumptions, but basically biologically the same as us, with more in common with us than the differences that are displayed. So understanding history is trying to understand human beings, and that's the aim. It's not about going in and judging them and saying these are right, these are wrong. It's about trying to see everybody's point of view, trying to understand everyone. With the past, we have the advantage that it's already happened. It cannot be changed. You can't go back and say, oh, if the Romans had been much nicer than this, then maybe the world would have been a better place. Or if the Romans had been less efficient than this, and say the Carthaginians had fought better, then the Roman Empire would never have happened, and wouldn't the world have been better? None of that, it's an idle speculation. It might be an entertaining conversation, but it's never going to be more than that. The past has happened. Ranting about it, complaining about it, condemning it doesn't change that reality. The reality is something that we need to understand because it helps to tell us more about human beings, which tells us more about ourselves. So that's the idea. Go without prejudice, go without passion, go without anger, and try to understand it on its own terms. Don't impose your own ideas on the past, because that will only tell you about yourself, and it will simply be then a useful tool for you to say, well, I was right all along in all my beliefs about the modern world or theory of how human beings operate and all this sort of thing. Try to understand it on your own terms. Be willing and open to admit there are lots of things we don't know and we can't know, and also you will come across things where ideas you've cherished in the past, written about in the past, prove to be wrong because the evidence doesn't fit them, and admit that, or admit when somebody else has come up with a better idea, because that way we all learn. So that's my take on how to approach history. As I say, like Tacitus, without anger, without passion, but we'd all hope we're doing a slightly better job than he managed. But again, that might be arrogance and prejudice and self-importance on our own part. But try to do it without preconceptions. Try to understand it on its own terms and let it speak for itself, and treat all the sources of evidence, all the peoples involved, all the players involved by the same standards. Because that's your best way of getting to, probably not the whole truth, but as much of the truth as we can manage to establish at such a distance in time.